Rachel, do we hit something? Oh, we're live. Hi, welcome to the Google Hangout on our first administrative topic in this series. Jason Evans has been hosting conversations for the past several months, and we're taking a little different turn in our conversation and talking about parish finances, and we're very grateful that you're joining us today. There are two very skilled individuals with depth of experience joining us. I'm Kathleen Hall, and I work with Human Resources and Administration with the diocese, and was a parish administrator for a couple of years before joining the diocese. And with us today is Kelly.
Hi.
You want to tell us a little bit about your experience?
I'm a county associate here at the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. I've been here for about a decade, and I usually do day-to-day accounting operations here for the diocese.
That's great, and we're especially grateful to have Jib Bailey with us, and he brings a wealth of experience. Jib, you mind telling us a little bit about your background?
Well, my background, before I retired, I was the budget officer for the Office of the Secretary in the Department of Labor for about 12 years. And one of my interests has always been in church finances. And so when I retired, at about that time, the fiscal officer in our church retired as well, and I was hired to replace her. So I've been working in Grace Church in Silver Spring for about 12 years. And then got involved through the Finance Committee into going into a variety of other churches in the diocese, primarily churches in transition calling a new priest. So I've been involved in maybe about 20 churches in the diocese, and sort of looking at again, best practices in accounting and budgeting operations, and then have been on special assignment to a couple of other churches. So that's my background.
Thanks very much, and thanks for making your way to Church House to be with us today. There are a couple of notes as we get started. There are opportunities to ask questions, and there'll be time for responding to questions. And if you would like to do that, you can email your questions to roundtable@edow.org. That's roundtable, one word, at edow.org. Or you can tweet them with the hashtag EDOW Roundtable, all one word, EDOW Roundtable. And we hope you will send us your questions. As we were talking, and especially Jib commented that the financial situations of parishes vary so greatly across the diocese. And so when we were approaching what information to share, we thought we would try and hit the high points, because it's very hard to be parish specific in this kind of a conversation. And so I'm going to start by asking Jib, when we think about internal controls, those are the measures that are put in place to make sure that monies, checks, credit cards are handled appropriately and that fraud and theft is prevented. What would you say are your top 3 tips for having good internal controls in the parish?
Well, I think my top tip is to get 2 signatures on virtually everything. I think one of the problems in any church is because it's relatively small in size, the administrative staff is small regardless of the size of the parish. It's really hard to get 2 people who can do one job, because there just aren't enough people to have a real separation of duties. But if you get 2 signatures on virtually everything that's done, there's at least a cross-check, whether it's a deposit that's processed on Sunday morning and you have 2 counters, or whether it's a weekly deposit during the week where you get someone to co-sign, whether it's an authorization. So in other words, if somebody, you shouldn't be able to authorize a transaction, pay a transaction, and sign a transaction, just one person. So if you're the authorizing official and the person who generates the check, get somebody else to sign the check. I think that's probably the #1 thing. And then secondly, have a backup for everything. Even if a receipt is lost, have somebody sign and say, I lost the receipt, so that there's always a documentation for everything. It'll offset the fact that generally one person is responsible for an awful lot in the financial area of most churches. There clearly are very large churches where that's not true. I think the second best internal control is to take advantage of reconciling monthly accounts, monthly checking accounts, monthly investment accounts. Anything that you can reconcile, make sure that your internal accounting system reconciles with the external documents that you get from the banks, from your investment firms, from any other source. Because as long as you can reconcile on a monthly basis, I think that you will minimize your chance of error. And then probably the third best internal control is to set up a chart of accounts that represents your budget so that you have an idea of the year starts of how your finances are going to unfold, both in terms of income and expense. And then you have a chart of accounts that condenses all of the raw data into a form that you're familiar with, and you can find variances really quickly. I think those would probably be my top 3 recommendations. Kelly, you may have some others. I don't know, from your viewpoint.
From my viewpoint, first off, is receipts, backup documentation. You can, especially on the AP side, you cannot have enough.
What's AP?
Accounts payable.
Okay.
You should always at least have one receipt or one backup documentation for every check you have. It helps out a lot. Probably the second thing is well maintenance of your files. Always keep on my accounts payable section. I usually keep things alphabetical order, and if it's a major transaction, I keep things per vendor. Usually more than half a dozen times a year, there should be a individual file for that vendor. This will keep questions down to a minimum, and if you do get a question, you can answer it promptly and quickly. Probably the final thing is promptness. Involved with any reconciliation or anything else, you shouldn't delay anything longer than you need to. The longer you wait to reconcile something, the more difficult it will be. So you should periodically, quarterly, monthly, whatever it takes, get a general cycle where you reconcile these things and not leave it to the end of the year, where you have a lot of holes and things are much more difficult to reconcile.
That's, as you were talking, one of the things that struck me is that sometimes parish treasurers and administrators are the ones who have to be the bad guys. What are times when you say, until this happens, I just can't do that for you? What are some of the circumstances at which there are some requirements that have to be met before you reimburse or pay or move forward on a financial transaction?
Approval with somebody with that's a signatory authority for that entity. Okay. Without that, nothing can be done.
Okay. I think that's right. Again, we have a system where individuals are responsible for specific accounts, and I communicate with them at the end of every month. Just like Kelly was saying, he's exactly right. If you reconcile on a monthly basis, it makes it so much easier. Your bank accounts come in monthly. It's easier to keep the reconciliations current than to have to go back several months when you may have lost track. But what we have is sort of a system of reporting back to the responsible individual. So any action charged to an account goes through the person responsible for the account. You may have various people. I'm thinking, this is not a criticism at all, but I think of the Altar Guild a lot in our church. There's so many people that have interactions with the Altar Guild that I'll get claims for reimbursement for different things, but the head of the Altar Guild, or the person responsible, the treasurer for that account, verifies each of the charges so that that person oversees the account and is responsible for it. I think the other piece is, and again, we're blessed by having a really talented rector who's interested in finances, and I think it's important to keep the priest involved, because ultimately there are going to be questions and the priest is going to have to make the decision. Maybe it won't always go the way that the fiscal officer wants, but at least the fiscal officer needs to get a fair hearing. And it doesn't often come to that, but at least there's a mutual understanding of the issue, so the fiscal officer doesn't find himself or herself sort of on the outside trying to control things without any support from the priest.
Great. One of the things that we wanted to share with the participants, and many of you may be aware of this, is the Manual for Business Methods in Church Affairs. This is a great resource from the Episcopal Church, and it's going to be, there'll be links to it. There are some links already on our website, but there'll be links to it after this. But I wanted to go down real quickly and just show you the sections. It gives you tips on every piece of this. I'm sorry I'm moving so quickly. It talks about your records management.
It does, right. It's excellent. It's excellent.
It is. And then also the basics of internal controls, bookkeeping, taxes. So if you've not been using this, we'd encourage you to download it, and you can use it at any time. And then click share. Okay. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about, and we will allow for questions towards the end, is gift recording, because that is a big portion of what people who are handling financial transactions deal with. And so, Jib, you want to start us off with some of the must-dos around gift reporting?
Sure. One of the challenges that we have is we'll get even a consolidated check. We get gifts for a variety of purposes. And making sure that we properly record the gifts to the right account is pretty critical to us. We don't want to confuse pledge payments with payments for altar flowers, contributions to the altar guild, as I've mentioned, and other purposes. So one of the things that we do that has worked well for us is we send out a quarterly statement. I'm sure most churches do, but it's a summary of all of the gifts by account. Our system, actually, our financial system, actually allows us to itemize every transaction, every contribution. So a person receiving the statement can see by date, purpose, and amount every gift that they've made over the course of the year. So obviously the first quarter is not too detailed. By the end of the second quarter, you've got a variety of gifts. By the end of the third quarter, you're almost to the end of the year. What we started doing a couple of years ago, again at the suggestion of our rector, is we send out a statement, a detailed statement at the beginning of December. I know it's late for you all to do this, but it's certainly something to consider for next year. It's sort of a dry run on what your contribution statement for tax purposes is going to look like when you mail it out in January. But by this time, especially at the beginning of December, you've got a pretty good idea of what you've given. And so the people in your parish will be much more attentive to make sure that their gifts were properly recorded. The other thing we do, of course, is we send a little note and say that we are careful in who we send the note to, but we know who's behind in their pledge. And they may get a little automatic, just sort of a little insert saying, if you're behind in your pledge, please try to catch it up before the end of the year. So we have what we call the surge every December, where people race to catch up on their pledges, and we sort of prompt them a little bit by putting this little note in with their statement. One of the things that's happened to us this year, we started a capital campaign, and so we have pledges not only for the operating budget, but pledges for the capital campaign. One of our difficulties is some people will simply write us a check, and they won't specify how to distribute the check between capital campaign pledge and an operating pledge. And we're pretty good at it, but we're not perfect. And this statement in December lets people say, whoa, that check back in January, not January, that's not fair, that check back in September probably should have been for the capital campaign, and you put it in the operating pledge. So please make that transfer. And what makes it easy for us is we can make that transfer in December while it's still in the same year instead of going back and getting it later. So the biggest challenge for us is making sure that we properly credit all of the contributions to the right source. And the cross-check we have is sending out these quarterly statements at a minimum, and then again, sort of a preliminary end-of-year statement around the beginning of December, so that people can make sure from personally that we've done it properly, and then we encourage them obviously to get back to me and get it fixed. Relating to the chart of accounts, which I referenced earlier, you want to make sure that your chart of accounts allow you to differentiate between different types of contributions. So you don't want to commingle capital campaign contributions with operating contributions. You don't want to commingle flowers. We take collections for flowers that are dedicated on the altar each Sunday. You don't want to be able to commingle flower contributions with pledge contributions. Another thing, it doesn't happen too much, but we do, of course, have a holiday fair at the end of every year. We absolutely have to make sure that we can separate those funds so that we don't commingle those kinds of gifts. I think that's a major challenge.
And Kelly deals with another side of the giving, and that's people's promises to give. What's important to be mindful of with those promises?
With the individual churches, basically there's a letter that we send out currently about this time of year where we ask where they have their NOI or the normal operating income from 2 years ago, and we ask them what they're going to pledge this year. We collect that for all the churches. We keep it on file. That our auditors request that as backup, and basically we go in, and usually the vestries approve it about the end of January to 1st of March, and in that time period by the end of February we go into our accounting system and upload those in there so that when we send you monthly invoices, that will be reflected on those invoices, and as payments are made,
you see it declining.
You see it slowly declining, but hopefully a zero by the end of the year.
That's great, and that same process would be true of the pledges that you receive. That those pledges, although circumstances may change and the numbers may change, that is considered a financial document that needs to be retained.
Correct. Absolutely. Again, what we deal with a little bit, and Kelly alluded to it even at the diocesan level, we get some parishioners who want to prepay next year's pledge for tax purposes. They'll get credit for the payment this year, but they're really applying it to the pledge for the following year. So we have a separate account set up outside of our operating budget where we can sort of house that prepayment until January of next year, of the coming year, and then transfer it into the operating budget. As Kelly alluded to, sometimes people are in arrears for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they don't know they're in arrears, even though we send out these statements, and sometimes they want to make good on a pledge payment, but something happens and they can't. And so we actually have an account set up where people can, it's called a late payment, a payment on a prior year pledge. And so we allow people to make payments after the close of the year and sort of roll it back to the prior year. We have a separate account set up for that. So we still account for it in the year in which we receive it. They still get tax credit for it the year in which we receive it, but they can apply it to a previous year. So I think it's the same thing that Kelly deals with, we deal with also.
Yeah. Okay. Before we move into our next section, which will be payroll and 1099s, there are some questions that have come in. Jim, do you mind reading the question? Let's take a couple of questions.
Sure. The first one I got is from St. Matthew's Parish in San Mateo in Hyattsville. And it says, we currently have 5 services beginning Saturday evening and running through Sunday evening. The weekend collections are deposited in a bank night depository. Our collections include upwards to $1,500 in cash. When the Sunday evening service is over, it's dark outside. Would it be foolish to have someone carry all the collections and any additional income, which may include more cash, at one time to the bank when it is past sunset? Maybe most of the money should be deposited during the middle of the day on Sunday. And it's from the treasurer, Martin Gackenheimer at St. Matthew's, San Mateo. My response to that is absolutely it's a sensitive issue, and you'd certainly know the location of your church. I'm always leery of making deposits of a lot of cash, or actually almost any cash, especially when it's dark outside and almost regardless of the neighborhood. You just don't know. My recommendation, and I don't know how, one of the issues that we confront is, like at the bank we use right now, we can pull the car up right in front of the night deposit box. There generally are 2 people. We generally have 2 people make our deposit. So it's not one person by himself or herself, but also the car headlights are on. So the person is never in the dark. I would be very concerned about making, if I couldn't keep my car in sight and have someone keeping me in sight, I would probably do as Martin may suggest and lock the cash safely in the church and take it during the day the following day, whether it's Sunday during the day or whether it's even Monday during the day.
Great. Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
then
Thank you.
another question? Was there another question that came in?
No, I think that was the only one that we had right now.
Okay, great. Then let's move into the last section where we talk about changing the nature of our financial transactions and sending it out to people through payroll and 1099s. Jib, you want to talk with us a little bit about payroll?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say under payroll is there's one absolute thing that has to be done by every church in the diocese, and it catches me sometimes because our budget isn't ready, but the housing allowances have to be, by IRS regulation, approved for priests for the coming year prior to December 31st of the year before. So like as of the end of this month, housing allowances for next year should be in place. Now, it doesn't say that they can't be amended once the year begins and your budgets are finalized, but there should be some documentation that a preliminary housing allowance for 2015 has been approved prior to December 31st, 2014. The technical reason is because I don't know about most churches. Well, I do, but know about most churches in the diocese. Don't know about all of them. But generally, priests want their housing allowance like the beginning of each month. You can crack a joke about why, but we won't go there. But anyway, so that housing allowance has to be paid on the 1st, and it's generally not a problem, but there ought to be some documentation from the vestry saying that the housing allowance payment in January has been approved. So that's not quite the payroll thing, but I would put that out there as sort of a requirement.
And it does get recorded. It does get recorded separately from the base pay for.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so that needs to be clearly delineated. The second thing, sort of setting up for again, there are two facets of payroll. One is what you do to close out the current year, and one is what you do to start up the new year, which happens sort of simultaneously. What we've done in our church, and I think it's, again, because so many people are sort of one-person shops, I prepare a memo for the priest to sign specifying the salary for each person on staff, and that excludes the housing allowance. That's a different requirement. And then when the first payroll payment is made in January, I again have documentation that's signed by someone other than me to authorize the payment of that first payroll check. It doesn't mean it can't be adjusted once the vestry finalizes the budget, and then an adjustment can be made in a subsequent paycheck. But at least there's documentation for the first paycheck, even if the documentation is simply make the same payment as was made last year. So that's sort of how I set up the coming year. And then, of course, the major pieces for closing out the prior year, you have to get the W-2s out, you have to get 1099s out, you have to reconcile your quarterly 941s with the W-2s that go out.
What's a 941?
The 941 is a quarterly report. It's the quarterly withholding report that's sent to the IRS, and basically it's your tax withholding, the income tax withholding from employees' paychecks. It's also the FICA withholding from employees' paycheck, plus the FICA contribution from the parish. Those are the three primary components of a 941.
Great.
And every 3 months, basically, by the close of the month following the end of the quarter. So it would be like April for the first quarter of the year, July for the second quarter, October for the third quarter, and January for the fourth quarter of a year. You have to submit these quarterly reports, reconciliations. There are two purposes. One purpose is to make sure to reconcile the payments. The other thing is the IRS is obviously pretty strict about how frequently these payments are made. So they can actually audit the 941, determine when the payments should have been made and when the payments were made, and sometimes people can be subject to penalties if the payments were made beyond the IRS deadline for each payment. But clearly reconciling the 941, the W-2, and the W-3 is the summary of the W-2s. Reconciling those reports is a critical piece of closing out payroll.
One of the other things that parishes may receive, depending on the benefits that their clergy and staff, is imputed income. And you probably would have received notification from the diocese within the last week, and that gets reported on the W-2 as well. And you can call me if you have any questions about that. One of the things that we want to show you, do you mind, Kelly? Do you mind? Kelly is my technician in addition to being the accounting associate. If we can go to the CPG website and screen share that. The Clergy Tax Guide is a free download from cpg.org, and it's updated every year, and it provides tremendous information, especially about clergy taxes, which can be confusing both for the administrator or the treasurer who's trying to record information for payroll, and for the clergy person who's trying to determine what to do with self-employment taxes. So this is free, easily accessed, and we hope that you'll take advantage of it as a resource. And then we'll go back to Google Hangout. Okay, and Kelly, if you want to start off just briefly on 1099s and what's required to be done through a 1099.
Time to start with 1099s is probably this current time. What you probably want to do is start pulling vendor files and vendor lists and see how much individually each of your vendors accumulate over the course of the year. When you're looking at 1099s, you're looking pretty much at the church level at a labor cost that wasn't covered by salaries, but you paid for by another check. Yeah. What's not included is if you paid travel, mileage, reimbursables, if they bought supplies, or even coffee along the way. That's really not included. Basically, we're looking at just straight up work hour labors involved with this particular entity.
And what's a threshold?
$600 would be the threshold annualized. If they're less than $600, you do not have to report that to the IRS.
Okay.
Once you take a look at your vendor list and see all the different individuals that qualify under this, your next step is to look in your vendor files and see if you have a W-9 on file for them. A W-9 is a simple form provided by the IRS. You can Google W-9, it'll come up instantly. It's basically asking the name, address, and the federal ID, tax ID number. Basically, in most of your cases, it'll be the Social Security number of that individual. You would want to get that from the individual if you do not already have it on file and place that in your vendor files. Starting in January, and this is due by the end of the month, the last business day in January, there's a simple form called the 1099 that you can also see if you Google that. You can also buy these forms at Office Depot, Office Max, or anywhere of those kinds. And you basically go in, you fill out the name, the address, the federal ID number, and then you do the amount that you paid the vendor over time, minus the reimbursables, minus the mileage,
yeah,
minus the coffee and everything else.
Wages only.
Wages only.
Okay.
And you mail that out to the parties that qualify under this. They have approximately a month, about 4 weeks till the end of February. If they disagree with either the amount or you didn't take out a reimbursable summary, they'll be more than happy to contact you, and you have time before you submit it to the IRS to change it, or change of address or anything else on the form. This is a federal document. You want to get it as correct as possible.
Right.
At the end of February, there's another form that you fill out and submit to the IRS. I forget the form.
Is it the 1096 maybe?
1096. And you fill that out. You have the main signatory.
It's a team effort.
You have the main signatory, your priest, sign for that, and you submit that to the IRS, and that's due on the last business day of February.
Yeah, and this is when we're also the senior warden can be signatory as an authorized signature. Okay, great. All right. Well, we are, believe it or not, we're wrapping up. Are there any more questions?
We've got one more question in. And this also comes from St. Matthew San Mateo. And the question is, currently banks are reluctant to give us small bank accounts. So in your presentation, are you keeping internal separate church accounts that are in fact in one bank account? And the answer for Grace Church is yes. The answer is absolutely yes. We again, we actually have 2 checking accounts that the bank mandated because we have a capital campaign with pledges of $1 million, and we have a line of credit for $500,000 against that $1 million campaign. So the bank mandated that we keep a separate checking account to clearly delineate those funds. All of our other funds are in one checking account, and just as Martin suggests, within that one checking account, we have operating funds, altar guild funds. We probably have about 30 very small funds where the one operating fund obviously is the major fund. That's about $800,000 a year. And then our other funds are basically any fundraiser. Like if the youth group has a fundraiser, we set up a separate account within the overall checking account so that the youth can keep those funds separate, and we report those funds to them. So the answer would be absolutely the banks. We don't want to be setting up separate bank accounts for each fund source. The cost would be prohibitive with the fees that we would pay. But also it's easy enough for cash flow purposes to keep all of the cash in one checking account and just have sub-accounts. Again, we call them restricted or reserve accounts that are not operating accounts, where we can just run cash balances so that the youth group could draw down its funds whenever it needed without having just a lot of cash sitting around and not earning any interest. I hope that, Martin, answered your question.
Beautiful.
And actually, someone wrote in and said, you mentioned a separate account for flowers, pre-pledge payments, capital improvements. Should there be a separate account for each of these? And the answer would also actually, for us, be no. If the bank required it for the capital campaign, but we would not want to have a separate checking account for other sources. Just as Martin sort of indicated, we would have one overarching checking account, and then we would have sub-accounts within it that we would maintain, but we would just reconcile the total balance.
So it's really, when you're talking about those accounts, you're talking about within an accounting software system or on a spreadsheet, not actually a banking account.
Absolutely. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. Kathy,
that's
exactly
okay.
right. The second account was also
in very many different ways.
For payroll items, 1099s, W-2s. Would a company like Paychex do that work for you? Paychex would certainly, ADP, any of those firms would do the W-2s, the W-3s. It would be unlikely that those firms would do 1099s. Kelly may have more experience with this than I. They would not do our 1099s because we would not make our 1099 payments to private contractors through our payroll system because of the fees. Kelly, is that consistent with you?
We're looking at each other and saying it depends. We switched to Paychex Online a couple of years ago, and they actually do have the capability of doing 1099 reporting, and that way the person's wages are captured and they're able to receive payment through direct deposit, which is a benefit to them. And Paychex, and it's for a small fee, it's not astronomical, but there is a fee associated with having them manage your 1099s also. Kelly, because most of our vendors aren't being paid through Paychex, right. Kelly goes through 100 or so 1099s, 200, yeah, every year. Yeah, but some of the payroll systems do have that capability, and if you're only dealing with a dozen, it may be worth it to make that investment.
Probably the easiest way to answer the question is whoever issues the check is probably responsible for the 1099. If you went to the Paychex or a second system to authorize the check, they should do the 1099. If you did it in-house, then in-house should authorize the 1099.
And then we got a question: if a priest is paid more than $600 in a year, you are saying there should be a W-9 on file? And my response would be absolutely. Kelly?
Yes.
I actually think that Kelly may know again more than this about this. The I-9 has actually surpassed the W-9 as a required document on hand. We are required to have I-9s on file for all of our salaried employees. I don't know if the diocese...
for salary, yes, for salary, and hourly wage employees that are considered W-2 employees, there absolutely should be an I-9 for every single one of those employees.
And I think our interpretation is for anyone making more than $600 a year, we need an I-9 because we have to be able to back up the 1099 if we send it out. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay. I hope that responded to that question. So I think the answer would be yes, you better get to your priest quick.
And it's simple. It really is. It's one of those 2-minute painless efforts that then you're done with and you can rest easily.
That's exactly right.
Thank you so much for joining us. And Jib, you know how much we appreciate all you do for the diocese. Kelly also. And we'll have the links to the resources available for you when we conclude. Hope you all have a very blessed Christmas.
For sure. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you.